Great.
Thank you, Zachary. I will start this presentation by sharing my screen. Let's see how it works. Share screen. Yes, I think. This roundtable is about how it's a reflection about how our research is or is not colonized today in Latin America. Let's see. I'm a professor at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. My name is Danilo Silva Guimarães. And I invited Daniel Camparo Ávila from the UDELA University in Uruguay, and Hernan Sanchez from Universidade del Valle, Colombia, and Renato Silva Guimarães from the Friedrich Alexander University in Germany. They will present. Hernan said me that he's today with COVID, so he could not come. So we have only Daniel and Renato today discussing with us. Well, my idea to discuss this issue is because I'm a professor at the University of History and Philosophy of Psychology, and we are usually working with ideas that come from Europe, Soviet Union, or United States, and these ideas kind of colonize most of the researchers in all over the world and also in Latin America. And our students at the University of São Paulo, they don't know very well the authors from Latin America, and they know it. And so for me, it's important to reflect on why it's happening and how can we change and include authors and theories from Latin America in our classes, for instance, and in our research. It looks, this map resembles somehow the process of industrialization in which Latin America countries are used to send raw material to be processed, and then we buy expensive goods from these places, and looks like the same in the sense that we give the raw material of the data for knowledge construction, and the theories are mostly based on ideas that come from these countries that sometimes they are very exotic to our way of living. So historically, I think it's related with the history of the European ethnocentrism. In the 19th century, it was marked by the fascination that took over the Europeans in relation to the ways of life of natural people, indigenous people, for example, in contrast to their own way of living, which they affirmed to be the ways of the person who has culture. The former were seen as less developed than the later. Vossner points out that the 19th century European psychologists clearly projected this distinction in their views of the primitive man. Wundt and other psychologists in the 20th century incorporated the consensual view that the distinction between nature and culture applied to the European distinction as them. So we also see in the 19th century in the scientific ground an idea that is based on biological evolution and cultural history as evolutionary history, in which the societies evolved from the hunter-gatherers to the Western scientists, and then who doesn't belong to this culture has less chance to be listened. And these ideas are also related in Latin America. They were reproduced in Latin America with the notion of eugenia, the practices of eugenic practices, and the practice of whitening our mentalities. So this painting from Modesto Broco's, The Redemption of Cain, you see a black woman and a white man, and here is a less black woman and a white baby, like a way of seeing the progress of the society, but not only in the sense of eugenics policies, but we also think in the sense of whitening of mentalities. So I study from Heinrich Heine and Nora Zion showed that 96% of psychological samples of the top journals in 6 subdisciplines of psychology come from countries with only 12% of the world's population. Of the remaining 4%, the samples used in these countries are not representative of the population as a whole. In this context, cross-cultural psychologists tend to construct psychological process as part of the human nature, but categories constructed according to the view of particular traditions. So Latin American population are not studied, and when they are studied, is the part of the society that doesn't represent the population itself. And but some of these studies, or most of them, generalize this knowledge as if they were a natural psychology. Well, I think that the colonization of the territory of the knowledge, it's important now. Some from the last decades, some studies are showing how different kind of knowledges came from, for instance, indigenous people in Latin America. About 60% of the world's food supply originated from the Amerindian traditions. Gender studies are showing how indigenous people relate with gender in a most sophisticated way, and it's now contributing to studies in this topic. In the sense of politics, the indigenous participatory democracy, the notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity, community-based alternatives to totalitarianism, and community-based land management, proposals of restorative justices also, and knowledge. All this knowledge reflects in arts, in science, and also in psychological care. Well, and then now I put in my abstract, in the abstract of this roundtable, some possible contributions from qualitative inquiry to understand all this process. I think that we need to propose theoretical and methodological shiftings to the mainstream, constructing knowledge about how to decolonize our psychological research and practices, criticizing universality and generality of mainstream psychological theories and methodologies, and proposing a historical review of the psychological knowledge, showing that the Latin American data is not only raw material for conceptual processing from exotic perspectives. So now I will ask to Daniel to present his work after Renato. Thank you very much. And in the end, we open the space for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Danilo. I will share my screen also. Well, I have named this presentation as Imperialism is a Paper Tiger, Psychology is a Paper Boat. And in this presentation, I would like to pay tribute to a pioneer of Uruguayan psychology, Juan Carlos Carrasco, as a part of the commemorations of his centennial in 2023. I would also like to thank Danilo Guimarães for the invitation to the table. In June 1973, a civilian military coup d'etat took place in Uruguay. The armed forces expelled Carrasco from the university and the School of Medicine where he worked, and he fled to Chile, where the socialist government would be overthrown 4 months later, and next to Netherlands. In both countries, he worked as a professor and researcher, working closely with other Uruguayan immigrants escaping from violence and persecution. Even today, 1/4 of Uruguayans live in other nations, a group that proportionally is only exceeded by Palestinians. In 1985, Carrasco returned to Uruguay. At the time, he was instrumental in creating the School of Psychology in Universidad de la República, the country's public university institution. He was certainly a creator of institutions, a high school, professional associations, etc. But his most known contribution is a theoretical formulation that begins with analyzing the psychological effects of the exile and goes through the influence of context on human behavior. He assimilated a concept by the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, I am myself and my circumstances, and devised a critical alternative psychology, which presupposed a new role for psychologists in Latin American countries, away from the academic walls and into their social environments. Considering the social cultural diversity of people in Uruguay and questioning the universality and adequacy of psychotherapeutic models and intelligence tests designed by and taught for weird populations, Carrasco challenged them as ineffectual methods of psychological evaluation and health promotion. For instance, when in the Wechsler intelligence scales, Uruguayans were asked about who is the president of the United States, most of them failed and were then considered less intelligent. This would last for decades before the cultural adaptations of the tests. Carrasco's legacy is an orientation program for the actual activities of the faculty staff, such as the pre-professional training of psychology students. More specifically, I shall address my practice as a supervisor of students at clinical consultations with children with developmental problems and their families in the environs of Montevideo. This is the most populous part of the city, with approximately 15% of the capital's population. Some 4,000 boys and girls are born every year there, almost 10% of the births in the country. More than half of them are born in poor homes, many in conditions of rights violations and limited access to public services. Less than 25% of children from 0 to 3 years of age in this territory, for example, have access to early childhood education. They are born in families where their mothers have been harmed by their partners, experienced problematic substance abuse, or committed attacks on their small bodies. Environments with low income and frequent losses of what was once possible to accumulate, where parents have disappeared, are imprisoned, or died in work accidents, murders, or suicides. Grandfathers and grandmothers are often in charge of taking care of these little ones. In other cases, an aunt or an older sister, but generally they were not prepared or wanted it, feeling overwhelmed and unavailable to subjectively shelter these boys and girls. We consider these children as at risk. The scientific literature shows us the importance of this moment for the formation, maturation, and stabilization of connection between neurons of the central nervous system. We have extensive knowledge about how primary process of psychic structuring should happen, such as language acquisition, organization of cognitive functions, and affective attachments. We are also aware of the life-lasting effects of systematic maltreatment in infancy. They do not have a diagnosis, yet their emotional and behavioral problems are already a burden for their families and communities. Moreover, they are at risk of beginning a more or less defined trajectory of social construction of the self, in a sequence of events that includes complaints from the initial education center staff, psychiatric interventions at around age 6, mostly with methylphenidate, learning difficulties, academic failure, unemployment, problems with the law, etc. Our primary aim is to intercept these trajectories, create alternative ways for the development of the self. We consider it as mental health prevention. Otherwise stated, intervene, as in the meaning of the word itself, to come between. In this task, we are faced with the limitations of a psychology that was not designed for them. Their life events contrast with what is usually defined in manuals as etiology for child psychopathology: parental separation, the arrival of a sibling, entering kindergarten, etc. Instead, their social and political vulnerabilities and struggles stand out as main forces of their constitution as psychic subjects. Indeed, psychological concepts and technologies are powerful in appearance and could transform both people's lives and social structures. But when confronted to reality, Carrasco noticed, they were more like paper boats with which children play on bathtubs, but cannot stand a single wave when taken to the beach. Probably quoting Mao Zedong's comparison of imperialism and paper tigers, he provided an efficient image for understanding and transforming the nature of our practices. It should be obvious that psychologists alone cannot solve all the difficulties these persons are facing, and that interdisciplinary work is crucial. We can nevertheless identify ways in which the clinical situation promotes sensible transformations. Many of them are in connection with the affective dimension. Acting together for one or more goals, the student therapist and the network that shelters and supports the child share the joys and sorrows that arise from the therapeutic process. However, certain cognitive processes, such as perception and imagination, can lead to erroneous elaborations of the experience, such as pseudo-absenteeism. These are considered for some time as an enigma for students and coordinations, coming to be thought of as resistance or a lack of interest in treatment. But in reality, they had a much more disconcerting sense. The real lack was money for bus tickets, often putting some of the families in a dilemma, having to choose between the consultation, bread, or milk. However, as this problem is frequently reported barely at the end of the curriculum year, it must be addressed in a timely manner. Hence, the importance of things that are not said or cannot be said in the negotiation of points of view. It is a problem that can be reformulated in the framework of Stephen Frosch's critique of the clinical trends that prioritize the narrative in relation to the effects of psychotherapies. Narrating and recounting our experiences, in which we must also consider the correlates in the child's play, produces therapeutic effects precisely because it rearranges the structure and meaning of what has been experienced, beyond the catharsis and relief of being able to put it into words. As Losch shows, this is an insufficient response, particularly when we think of those people who remain on the fringes of the hegemonic discourses, for whom the reconstruction of a narrative coherence might not be an invaluable goal for their own lives. It is not enough to say that their experiences really do make sense. that not being able to access clinical care for their children due to a storm that has already passed, or having to choose between milk and bread or a bus ticket are two tragic experiences. For psychologists, it is a true narcissistic injury, when mental problems must be considered in relation to an unstable and cruel external reality. As in the anecdote where Donald Winnicott interrupts a meeting at the British Association of Psychoanalysts during World War II. I should like to point out that there is an air raid going on outside. However, this is the engine to shape a new way of mediation, which is only measured with the joint effort of a work among several ones, between the disciplines, between the clinic and the community. Dynamics of involvement and self-transformation, the third principle of Danilo Guimarães' indigenous psychology. Before transforming the world and people's lives, psychologists need to transform themselves, redefine their existence and their social role, including others and their surroundings. In this point, Carrasco's contributions reorient the practice, since they reinforce the need to see and describe reality on the territory, avoiding previously elaborated explanatory modes. Our task is not to illuminate or guide souls lost in the darkness, nor is it to pour on them the knowledge provided to us by the power of truth. They are the people themselves who know their problems, precisely because they are the ones who suffer them. And our work is to collaborate in the collection and return of this knowledge to whom it belongs by right. In order to finish, I would like to quote the final part of a lecture by Carrasco in 1969 at the 12th Inter-American Congress of Psychology held in Montevideo, entitled "The Role of Psychologists in the Contemporary World," which seems to me of an unbelievable contemporaneity. The psychologist is committed to his reality, just as he is committed to the men who are the object of his work. Between the psychologist and the object of his action, there is the psychological task that, in order to be scientific, cannot avoid being compromised. The sciences of man have ceased to be aseptic for a long time. The psychology of everyday life in Latin America is a psychology of man as a political being, because this is his main point of urgency. Psychologists, particularly Latin American ones, must reflect on the need for a thorough modification of their objectives and methods in order to shift in a true or authentic way from an individualistic psychology to a community psychology, from an aseptic psychology to a committed psychology, from a theoretical psychology to a psychology of everyday life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Daniel. And now, Renato.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Danilo, for the invitation. I would like to share my screen. My presentation is in a video in YouTube. Let me see how this can be done. This one. Share. Can you hear? Do you have the audio? No?
No.
Let's see. I never
share screen. There should be two boxes at the bottom left of the window that comes up. Just click those and share.
I choose, okay, share screen, share, but I don't have the control of the, because I need to select the audio, no?
Yes, there should be a bubble you click from that at the bottom left of the window that comes up.
No, I don't have this. Danilo, can you share for me the video?
Yes, I will connect it here, and because there is an option. There is an option share sound in the
Yeah, I
bottom.
cannot, I don't know where is this. I cannot see.
You
Okay,
may
I will get the link.
Okay, stop.
Just a minute. I'm getting the link now and share screen. Share sound here. Share. Can you
Knowing in Latin America, its contradictions and future revisiting
can you listen?
yeah,
Okay.
ways of knowing in Latin America, its contradictions and future possibilities. Meaning comes to us through the relationship that the body maintains with the environment. The language, which is already there, present, gives, through its metaphysical powers, the possibility of new meanings. Therefore, it always guides the or a refeeling as a re-existing. When at the end of 1920s, José de Andrade put Freud at his place, repression and Catholicism, he wanted to develop a psychological and psychoanalytical theory that made sense for the freedom of the fellow tribesman, the other, the savage, and his relatives. This has not been accomplished yet. At the same time, when the elaborations of Oswald agitated the cultural world, there was a local intellectual reflections in Brazil, practically invisible today, producing a consistent thought in the existential phenomenological philosophical field, Farias Brito, in the psychology and sociology, Manuel Bonfim, or in psychiatry and psychology, Juliano Moreira. All these authors have studied the place of the human spirit in historical and universal reality. Their analysis seems fruitful for all those who want to test categories that do not take cultural specificities and local experience by imposing a universalism from above. However, let us look with critical thoughts. These three texts are also imbued with the moral conception of the 19th century, the theme of national identity and the eugenic conception of sanitation. Revisiting these texts means, for these presentations, on the one hand, affirming our intellectual independence and overcoming the deficit condition in which local thought has been condemned, and on the other hand, explaining the experience of living in the real world. To express in full philosophical autonomy, the colonized people of the world must abandon their colonial mentality. This will be concrete only through a material and cultural revolution against the imperialistic power. Except for the word revolution used above, that was already the proposition of Franny Coutinho presented in the first Inter-American Conference of Philosophy in 1943. I use the word revolution for what Coutinho stated for total behavior and culture, and that beyond individualistic expressions like arts, music, or poetry. Therefore, welcoming foreign currents of thought, again with Coutinho, based in cooperation and friendship, end of quote. That means the domain of knowledge is political. So Coutinho argued against the colonial mentality in philosophy where, Coutinho said, even the reaction against one foreigner current is based on another current equally foreigner. Let us take a major example from a Brazilian perspective. The most influential philosophical movement in Brazil was positivism, and at the same time, one of the highest achievements in philosophy and in the problems of knowledge in Brazil was made by a wild anti-positivist named Raimundo de Farias Brito, born in 1862 and died in 1917. We can situate Farias Brito in the avant-garde of Western philosophy and in the autogenesis of Brazilian self-awareness, say Luiz Alberto Cerqueira, in Maturidade da Filosofia Brasileira. For Fred Gillette's term, 1925-2006, professor of philosophy at the University of New Mexico, in his thesis Existence in Search of Essence, Farias Brito's Philosophy of Spirit, published in 1961, showed that Farias Brito, in his motives and in his interpretation of the human situation, social and individual, is a parallel from a basic point of view with existentialism, and that there is, in the methodology proposed by him and in the philosophical program announced by him, a parallel with phenomenology. An important aspect of Farias Brito's philosophy is this conception of psychology as the science of the human conscience, refuting a scientific psychology that tries to reduce human nature to a psychophysiological analysis. The subjective dimension of human experience, the metaphysics, is a practical experience that cannot be reduced by the vices of the modern thought. Farias Brito say, the illusion of each system is its fixity, a prejudice found in positivist vision that contributes to the development of psychology as a psychology of brain. Farias Brito tried to solve metaphysical problems through psychology, identifying metaphysics with science of the spirit, a spirit that must be understood as something that encompasses the entire field of subjectivity, experience, feelings, perceptions, reaction, action. Psychology is the basis of all scientific knowledge. When Farias Brito criticized modern science and positivism, it is possible to say that he was also criticizing the exclusion of psychology. The young Brazilian Republic, founded in 1889, adopted positivism as a state philosophy. The motto in Brazilian flag, Order and Progress, has its origins in Auguste Comte's motto of positivism. The reform in education proposed by the Brazilian Republic was seen by Farias Brito as an attack and destruction of the philosophical education, imposing a technicist vision over an ethical vision of the society. He said, "When someone tells me about the wonders of modern civilization and reminds me of the telegraph, electricity, steam, air, navigation, etc., I cannot help myself but be moved, recognizing man's dominion over nature. But at the same time, I feel that my enthusiasm freezes when I see that the number of those who suffer increase instead of decreasing, and that lepers, cripples, beggars, and above all, mad people appear everywhere, making the crime statistics more and more terrifying." Farias Brito outlined: 1. The state orients the core of the curriculum, meaning the science and politics walk hand in hand. 2. Constate that the science is not engaged in social change, contribute, for example, to reduce inequality, etc. 3, I quote Farias Brito, "Philosophy, science, religion are therefore living manifestation of the spirit, natural and organic, necessary and fundamental." Farias Brito stated that in Brazil, the psychic element is treated only from a medical point of view. The only psychology that has been judged worth of study is that of the insane, he said. Despite the rich theoretical elaboration and local context, the intellectual production and ways of knowing Brazil is still dependent of external theories that, on one hand, ignore the local intellectual production, and on the other hand, impose a epistemic colonialism that's often hidden. In the beginning of the 20th century, it was in the Faculty of Law in São Paulo that psychology started to gain importance, becoming a discipline required for the admission. As said Farias Brito, indeed, it has been almost exclusively in the faculties of law that the science of the philosophical and psychic order have been cultivated among us. This is natural too. Law is, in itself, a psychic science. It is an applied science that's based on psychology. And under the same conditions that engineering is based on mathematics, under the same conditions that medicine is based on natural science. But it was conservatives, Catholics, and even fascists that had appropriated the thought of Farias Brito and transformed him into a hero of their aims. In the first decades of the 20th century, the psychic phenomena explained by biological causality prevailed in Brazil. The biologism eugenic is the cultural aspiration of psychiatry founded on an ideological and scientific basis. Juliano Moreira, 1872-1933, was still a teenager, 14 years old only, when he started the Faculty of Medicine of Bahia. He is considered the founder of psychiatric discipline in Brazil and the first to popularize psychoanalysis in the country. During his entire professional life, he was confronted with the structural racism of Brazilian society. He was black. It's important to know that from the 19th century until the first decade of the 20th century, Brazil was defined primarily by race, attributing the degeneration of Brazilian people to the miscegenation was a reality. Moreira contested the attribution of degeneration and the assumption that there would be mental illness typical of tropical climates. However, despite condemning what he called a ridiculous prejudice of color and castes, as confirmed by Ronaldo Ribeiro Jacobin about the position of Moreira, I quote, he did not reject the theory of degeneracy, questioning only some casual factors of it, such as race, climate, and the stereotyped use of degenerative stigmas, end of quote. In 1903, Juliano Moreira became the director of the mental health hospital, Hospício Nacional de Alienados, in Rio de Janeiro. And even if he was still associating cultural problems with psychiatry problems, he innovated, humanized the treatment, ending, for example, with the use of straight jackets, removing the bars from all the windows, and separating adult patients from children. Nevertheless, he applied the organicist gem model of Emile Kraepelin, 1856-1926 in Brazil. Influential proponent of eugenics and racial hygiene. At the second half of 1910s, the conception of the Brazilian inferiority linked with racial inferiority and climate is losing ground by the adoption of hygienic medicine, meaning that the government should create public policies to sanitize its people. Our inferiority is seen as that point as the resulting from the lack of health policies. Brazil is a big hospital, said the professor and physician from the Faculty of Medicine of Rio de Janeiro, Miguel Pereira, in 1916. Eugenics became the program of the public health, a movement with the slogan, to sanitize is to eugenize. Manuel Bonfim, born in 1868, died in 1932, was a Brazilian physician, sociologist, and psychologist, contemporary of Farias Brito e Juliano Moreira. In his book, América Latina, Males de Origem, Latin America, Evils of Origin, published in 1905, he analyzed the effects of colonization. He was in the counter-current of the dominant thought being against pseudo-scientificism, scientific racism, Arianism, social Darwinism, and against conservatism. He was also against all these forms of determinism that classify people from Latin America as inferior. Bonfim had a view of science as not only a descriptive tool seeking to understand the world, but also as an instrument at the service of the social transformation, recognizing that the subjectivity of science is not separate from the scientist's interest. situating the scientist in relation to his object is a political question. In Latin America, argued Bonfim, the parasite will take care of educating the parasitized. That is a direct and clear image of the political situation in Latin America and in Brazil. So when the poet and modernist Oswald de Andrade, born in 1890 and died in 1954, launching in 1928 his Cannibal Manifest, announcing the cultural anthropology as the new possibility to think and live as people in the Western Hemisphere, he already had a predecessor that elaborated a strong argument against the colonial mentality. Oswald's inclusion of different voices implies that the written text includes the unwritten speech. For that reason, the resumption of the native speech inside of the text would lead us to a sort of complementary symmetry, allowing the reality to be reached and or rediscovered. For him, rhetoric plays ironically in a dynamic of hiding and revealing some units or parts of the discourse, where the ignorance reveals important power stakes. Incorporating the results of the Western heritage, Oswald deconstructs disciplinary Holy Lands, his political and expansive and barbaric anthropology. He advocates that the era is a value in and of itself. Having said that, we can confirm that the cultural anthropology, despite being elaborated from a non-indigenous perspective, and despite being a philosophy of the boundary, hybrid, participate of the process of indigenization of the research by deconstructing Eurocentric and patriarchal concepts, pointing out that the indigenous cosmology differs radically from the meridian religions, so-called world religions, and indigenize by attacking the inherent violence of the Western humanism. Oswald tried to revitalize indigenous knowledge, rehabilitating the native cosmology as far back as the end of 1920s. Oswald indigenized humanities from outside, as a non-indigenous. Before post-colonial and decolonizing studies methodologies, Oswald responded and faced the genocidal logic. Indigenous knowledge, different modes of existence, push back the epistemological limits of Western knowledge and its bondage to theology and science, that achieved the progressive substitution of natural things characterized today by the actual destruction and replacement of our symbolic sphere, while it is anthropologized. There is unspoken text that scholars from ex-colonies even now avoid revealing. One of them is by dismissing metaphysical inquiry, saying that I would like to affirm that my relationship with metaphysics is somewhat unsettled because, again, the point is the difference between indigenous metaphysics and Western metaphysics. Does the practical dimension of metaphysics raised by Farias Brito make him an ally of the indigenous knowledge and ways of being? I'm not sure. What I'm trying to do here is precisely to reject the schizophrenic nature of Western metaphysics, to speak in the terms of Daniel Whitecat, and to review that to a certain extent we will find in contemporary indigenous thought analog critique. I quote Whitecat: American Indians must elaborate our own indigenous systems of metaphysics and contrast them with the dominant metaphysics of Western civilization. End of quote. Because the indigenous metaphysics is experiential, that is to say, I quote Whitecat, requires abstract concept formation in the service of experience. It rejects the schizophrenic nature of Western theologies and metaphysical systems in their abstraction beyond human experience. The experience is local. So Daniel Whitecat argues that education in the US, for example, I quote him, bears the largest imprint of Western metaphysics, and that the hope for American Indian education lies first in the explicit identification of features of the Western tradition of worldview that produce many of the problems we are immersed today. And secondly, in the active reconstruction of the indigenous metaphysical system. Western metaphysical constructs are antithetical to native culture and knowledge organization. My question is still open. How can or should qualitative inquiry in psychology incorporate the sovereignty of the indigenous ways of think and being? Revisit. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Renato. And now we have some minutes for questions. Please. If someone wants to make a question, just open the microphone or write in the chat. Well, I didn't see any question here, but I would like to maybe pose one question. I didn't know the Carrasco author that Daniel brought to the discussion, and I'd like to hear a little bit more if this author, how do you think this author could answer the question Renato put in the end of his presentation about the possible dialogue between the qualitative inquiry in Latin America with the indigenous societies? Because although I don't know very well this author, but I know that Uruguay has an indigenous population too, but and okay, how it can be thought there?
Well, well, it should be difficult to answer that since at Uruguay, the indigenous population was well, increasingly it increasingly became outside the social reforms of the society during the same period that Renato shows us, from the 20th century. I'm not sure, but I think it's probably Carrasco never could be in touch with indigenous people living in a more in a non-Western way. Therefore, their philosophies, their values, their culture, although they could exist as people, as living beings, they were increasingly assimilated by the Western theories, ideas, and ways of living. But this is a really interesting question, because that would be probably a important perspective for Carrasco, as to know not just the ways of living of the social contexts of of how capitalist societies became and thrive and struggle here at Latin American countries, but also as others other perspectives. If you look at his text is majorly influenced by phenomenology, Marxism, and all these central cultures perspective, although critical, but Western. And I would, yeah, I'm sure that it would be a really an important thing for him to get in touch with other perspectives for his thought.
Thank you, Daniel. Someone wants to ask or comment? So maybe I would ask one more question to Renato now. Is do you think that the construction of Latin American psychology imply a reconciliation with the indigenous ways of knowledge? I think that was your main argument. And looks that from what you say that the mainstream psychologists in Brazil, they were trying to be legitimated by Western philosophies of science and avoiding the indigenous conceptions. Do you have any hint or any suggestion about how can you solve the question you put in the end of your presentation? How do you think qualitative inquiry could help us to reconcile indigenous reflections and scientific knowledge construction?
Well, I think it's the need to recosmification. I mean, because we live in a Western society, is a cosmic society. We lost the cosmology, the modern science. So the only reference you can say in a hyperbolic way is Wall Street, because you secularization and science as reference. So I found interesting the question of Farias Brito, because for him religion, science, and is a different ways of viewing the world, is a kind of continuum of the human experience. So he will not propose like positivism to excluded one of these visions. So in my view, I think is this question of metaphysics, how the indigenous people understand the metaphysics, how they experience metaphysics, and the difference in contrast with how Western people experience metaphysics. When, for example, in France, the Notre Dame was on fire 2-3 years ago, I don't remember exactly. Everybody was shocked. Even if you are Christian, okay, it's a sacred place. It's very sad. If you are not Christian, but you have Notre Dame as a reference, you're also sad. But when, for example, the Amazon forest is burned, for indigenous, it's the same thing that's happening. When in California or any place in US, when, for example, a mountain is used only for the pleasure, is a mountain is considered a sacred place for the indigenous. This is the church of the indigenous. So the metaphysics of indigenous is really located in the land. So, but the metaphysics of Western cultures is something that's supernatural. So, so that's what I find interesting in Farias Brito, is this idea that metaphysics is something related with the human experience. But he used this vocabulary of 19th century or beginning of 20th century spirit, or it sounds very religious way of thinking. I mean, that's why he was also the conservative, the Catholics, the new movement of Catholics in Brazil took him as a reference to support the conservatism, or even the fascists took him, because anti-science or take from the side of the religion. But he was not directly related with this. but they have this divide, supernatural and this concrete experience with the land or the local experience. I think this is the point that can, when you think in a, take the indigenous perspective, is really is to try to understand their cosmology, relate with this experience, their own idea of metaphysical experience. So that is not religious in the sense of Western metaphysic. It's not a supernatural, but it's really empirical and experience with the world. So it sounds, when you listen, for example, often you listen indigenous people speaking, sounds that they have this, they are religious, or because they use these words that probably is not even translating their own language, sacred, or how you can also translate their own experience for our vocabulary, because often you use our vocabulary to push them in this kind of, they are stuck in a religious and this traditional life that is not, that's for us is considered as a past, something is not something is not present, it's not, but it's also this this anecdote of Levi-Strauss. I think he was in the border between Brazil and Peru when the colonizer arrived. What the indigenous made, he took a Spanish, he killed him and put in the river to see if the body float, if the body decomposed like an indigenous body. So because they doesn't know if they are in the same level of reality to interact with them for the war or for the conflict. So they make an empirical experience to understand, okay, we are in the same level of reality. But at the same time, in Europe, they are discussing if the indigenous people has a soul. No, they are discussing in a supernatural level. So the indigenous are the empiricists, and the Europeans, in that sense, are believe that they are living the scientific in the modern science. They are still applying their own ideological and metaphysical, even when they are pretending to do science. Now, the examples I gave, for example, is really clear in psychiatry in Brazil, how the ideology of eugenics interact with these the conceptions of these physicians in Brazil in the beginning of 20th century. Now, they stay very long into the 50s. Now, only in the 50s start to change this idea in Brazil. But this was considered a sign. This is the sign of the, and so you have all these contradictions between what and this idea of science is outside of ideology, or science is not outside of politics, and this is really problematic. And but it is, for me, it's really the question of cosmology, and review the question of cosmology in Western and primitive society or indigenous society. So that's, in my view, the starting point to address how the question of inquire, what that means, the inquire.
Thank you. Let's see if someone wants to comment. We have 1 minute left. No, nobody. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Renato. I've learned a lot, and I would like to learn more about Carrasco, and maybe we can study more. There is an author from Uruguay that's next to Brazil, and we don't know, actually. I'm just starting to get to know him from Daniel and the philosophers Renato quoted. I don't believe they are studied in Brazil, at least in the psychology. I don't think that many psychologists have already know about the names, so it's very, very hard for us, And I think it's an urgent task we have to get to know our authors, our philosophers, and start to work with their theories and ideas. Thank you very much.